The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, celebrates its 75th anniversary on April 4th this year. With all the talk about NATO's impact on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, let's dig into this organization a bit to discover what it really is, where it came from, and where it may be headed. All right, welcome everyone to the latest episode of the Headlines and History Podcast with me, your host, John Mollick. Thanks again to anyone who is returning, and a bigger thanks to anyone who's joining us here for the first time as we discuss the topics that are in today's headlines and the history behind those topics. Not a lot of time for the news or even some of your longer form media outlets to talk about the real foundations of what's in today's headlines, specifically in the foreign affairs, foreign and military sphere. And so that's what we do here. We talk about what's happening now, how it's relevant to yourself, to the rest of the world, and where all of that foundation comes from. So again, thanks for coming back, or thanks for joining us for the first time. So what are we going to talk about this week? Now, I think the most relevant topic is NATO, right? NATO, of all of the topics that are out there in the foreign affairs world, NATO is brought up almost daily. And this is obvious because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And this week, or last week, April 4th, is the 75th anniversary of the organization. And I just think it's a good time to talk about what's happened with NATO since its inception, what happened over the 75 years, and why it's still playing such a relevant role, such a prominent role, even though its initial intent was to be a bulwark, a European and American bulwark against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's not here anymore, but why is it still as relevant? And we're gonna get into all of that. There's some interesting history about it that I think is just not covered. As history lovers as we are, we can find some interesting stuff here. But we're also going to talk about how some of the decisions that have been made within the NATO leadership structure over the years led to, what seems obvious, right? Led to what NATO is today, but led to, more importantly, why NATO is acting the way that it is. Again, even though the Soviet Union's not around, and it's being talked about in Ukraine in particular, and Ukraine's not even a NATO country. So why is that? Where does the impetus come from? Where does the legality come from? And why is Putin in particular so upset at NATO? What did NATO really do to upset him? First, 32 countries. That's the total group within the Defense Pact. The desire for the West, if you will, Europe, the United States, Australia, New Zealand too, even though they're not physically in the quote unquote West, but part of the former British Empire. The desire for Europeans to unite along with the resource heavy and wealthy United States comes way before NATO was even formed. Right after World War II, that the UN was created, and then NATO in 49. But just because the documents were signed in 49 doesn't mean that the idea of a collective defense didn't start way earlier. And it did. And its roots really reach back to the earlier part of the 20th century and in the First World War. Legally, it does get its authority, if you will, from the UN Charter, specifically Article 51, which says that anybody within the UN has a right to collective defense if they so choose. And so that's exactly what happened in 49 when the original 12 countries came together and made a decision to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They if you're following international law, they were able to do so because Article 51 in the UN Charter said so. I'll go through, as we're discussing today, some of the reasons why some of the countries decided to join. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, but there are some particular incidents why some joined and others didn't, and we'll talk about that. But just to get it out of the way, here, the 32 countries that that are involved in the organization today. They have the original 12, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and then the UK and the US. In 52, just a couple years after the Second World War, you have Greece and Turkey. And then 55, you have West Germany, which is an interesting addition, and it might be obvious, but eventually West Germany joins. 82, Spain joins. 99, you have Czechia, Hungary, and Poland. 04, big year, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. 09, you have Albania and Croatia. 17, Montenegro. 2020, North Macedonia. And then just most recently, 23, Finland, and 24, Sweden. So a total of 32 countries. In the original document, they have the 12, and then it says, in addition, any other European state can join if they're in a position to further the principles of this treaty and to contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area. North Atlantic, again, meaning a combination of Europe and North America. Canada's involved minus Mexico, but North America nonetheless, at least most of it. And they use the title North Atlantic for that. So 32 countries, mainly European-based, aligned together for a unified defense, not only physically, tactically, but ideologically. The initial 14 articles in the NATO document describe, it's littered with language of supporting countries that believe in democracy, believe in the core principles of what you would consider the West being supportive of today: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, a free vote, and the people choosing who leads. Certainly not the idea that what we'll see is in the Russian sphere and eventually the greater Soviet Union, pretty much the opposite. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to before World War II and talk about really where the idea of this comes about. If we can pick a day, or if we can pick an event, rather, that would be the catalyst, it's going to be the Russian Revolution in 1917. So right in the middle of World War I, the empires are fighting. We all remember the shot heard round the world. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand is killed, kicks off World War I. And in the middle, the war doesn't end until 1917, the Russian Revolution takes hold. Tsar Nicholas II is kicked out. Vladimir Lenin, leading a bunch of individuals that he calls his Bolsheviks, they're one of many communist-leaning political groups in Russia. They end up coming to the top and becoming the most powerful, and they end up becoming the lead government, if you will, after the Tsar's kicked out in 17. And they decide that World War I is no longer an interest of theirs. They need to turn inward, stop focusing on whatever's happening in Europe, and fix the problems at home, rebuild the government, transition, end corruption, all these things. So now, at least in the war, Russia's first an ally. And then once the revolution hits and the Bolsheviks take over, they're no longer an ally. The Bolsheviks, even though the West understood that the Tsar wasn't the greatest of examples for leadership, they really don't want the spreading of communist ideals, which is exactly what Lenin's looking to bring in. So it's at this point that the trail begins, if you will. Now, we can have our debates all day long about the efficacy of people-led government and whether the communism that came to Russia was really the actual Leninism and Marxism of what the early ideals were and stuff. Not really the point here. Just what matters here is that whichever version of the socialism/communism was intended, it's not the political philosophy of the West. And so whatever Lenin is interested in implementing is not something the West feels is good for global stability. Early on, after Lenin takes a few years to look inside and fix some issues inside, they end up expanding their influence outward. And you have the creation of these Soviet Federalist Socialist republics officially in 1922, the first four, the first being Russian, and then you have Transcaucasian, and then you have the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. So four entities, if you will. They eventually get to 15 by 1956, but either way, now they've just taken another step in the eyes of the West of expanding this communist influence by not just keeping it at home to Russia, but saying, you know what, we're going to bring in the Ukrainians with us, we're going to bring in the Belarusians, some Transcaucasus countries, and we're going to make the world safe for communism, if you will. Not something the West likes. This is the time that we see the framework of an East-West divide start coming about. Never before did we look at the world in that way. And that there was the West on one side with its ideals and then the East on their side with their ideals. You know, we had empires prior to this time that were influential wherever they were in the world, but there wasn't this like line between left and right, or West and East. But this is when it starts to develop. It's not clearly delineated, but it's becoming like the puzzles being put together. Now there's other land, right? Obviously, with many people, Africa, they're not involved in this point. The Middle East is not involved; they're too small, and China really struggles through most of the 20th century, which ends up being a reason why they're expanding so greatly today, which is a whole separate discussion. But nonetheless, in that time, China is not having an influence in the international affairs arena, right? It's the West and the East, Russia being the main catalyst. Now, also, we have this East-West divide that's being built, but also understand that, again, even though NATO didn't come about until the Second World War, it's not that the West didn't have an idea of a unified, a collective defense. It started in World War I with Woodrow Wilson, his 14 points, and his idea of a League of Nations, and then trying to unite Western-leaning democratic countries to prevent another monstrosity like World War I. Clearly it didn't work. We had World War II, but that was the intent. And whether historians agree or disagree over whether the United States should have joined, the League of Nations never made it because the Senate in the U.S. never ratified the treaty. So the U.S., even though Woodrow Wilson wanted to be a part of it, they never joined the League of Nations. And then you'll see a historical connection to that event and the U.S. and Europe coming together with NATO, because Europe understood from the first failure of the League of Nations that an entity combined in Europe without the resources of the United States likely wouldn't work. It didn't work the first time. And if they're going to try to do it again the second time, it just simply wouldn't work without the U.S. So what it shows is, like I said, the ideological understanding of a collective defense way before NATO was even thought of. The third angle to this whole thing is obviously Hitler and fascism in the 30s, and then the late 20s and 30s into the beginning of the war in 39. Clearly, fascism is very different than communism, but nonetheless, there is that part of the thought that the West would need to unify against not only the Soviets, but the fascists. Ironically, the Soviets end up becoming an ally in World War II because of some poor decisions that Hitler made when he turned east in Operation Barbarossa and pissed off Stalin, and obviously the Soviet Union became an ally. But nonetheless, prior to then, when Hitler began World War II in 39, the Soviet Union was not an ally and was looked upon as a potential threat. It was only Hitler, really, that made Stalin and the Soviet Union an ally of the United States, a reluctant ally. So, as we've talked about on the podcast before, national security issues become your 50-meter target, and they allow you to make some decisions you wouldn't necessarily make. And that's exactly what happened in World War II. The West is fearing Stalin and his continued push to spread communist ideals, but Hitler becomes the 50-meter target. So the West, specifically the United States and Britain, Churchill, Roosevelt, they end up creating a necessary union to fight against the greater threat of Hitler and fascism, which they both hated, so the enemy of my enemy kind of thing. And you can see during the Second World War, through the relationships that Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin had with each other, that there was really a lack of trust. I mean, Stalin didn't really want to be working with Britain. Roosevelt didn't trust Churchill because he didn't trust empires. Churchill didn't trust Roosevelt because he thought he was too political and made decisions heavily focused on the vote and not necessarily what was right or wrong morally. The two of them didn't trust Stalin for obvious reasons. And Stalin, who we know was a nutcase and a dictator and a mass murderer, he wasn't interested in the, freedom of the press and freedom of speech kind of ideals that Churchill and Roosevelt had, right? So, but it's a necessary factor because everyone hated Hitler. And also, if you look at and study the relationship between the three, you can see that Churchill and Roosevelt, regardless of whether they had a different relationship, that the two of them had a different relationship with Stalin, that they both knew that this was a strange bedfellow. This is somebody that they wouldn't choose to be working with because the fears that they've had since all the way back to 1917 and the spread of communism still existed with Stalin, but they knew they just had to work with the guy in order to get through this Hitler and ultimately Japan and get through this before they can worry about what's happening with communism. So we talked about the East-West divide kind of being created like the early pieces of the puzzle coming together prior to World War II. Now we really have it coming together in a physical way where literal lines are being drawn after World War II. Right. So the victory comes after the bombs are dropped on Japan, and decisions are being made amongst the big three as to who's going to have influence and control over the countries that were defeated and then, eventually ultimately liberated. And Stalin, given that he had supported the efforts of the Allies with much blood and much treasure, he was afforded the opportunity to take control of, if you will, certain areas and certain lands that he wanted, just like Roosevelt and Churchill did. And it ended up becoming so competitive that they split Germany right down the middle. We did the same thing with Korea, and the Soviets controlled the eastern portion of Germany, and France, the United States, and Britain controlled the western portion. It was divvied up into 4 separate sections. Eventually, it was united, at least amongst the Western countries. But initially, it was 4 separate sections controlled by the 4 powers. And then Berlin was split, the capital split right in the middle, even though the entirety of Berlin fell within the Soviet sphere. They split the city, the eastern portion being Soviet, the western portion being Western, democratic, and a wall's built. And right then and there, you have the first decisions being made by those that won, where Stalin wanted to punish Germany relentlessly for starting the war, just like Germany was punished after World War I, which you could argue led to World War II. But either way, Stalin wanted to punish Germany. And so they wanted Germany to pay reparations. They wanted Germany to really be held down. And the West didn't view it that way. The West knew that a strong Germany would act as a bulwark against the spread of communism in the East. And so the West began to support Western Germany as best as they could, food and rebuilding, construction, all these things. And Stalin didn't want to do that. You go back to the Truman Doctrine, Truman being the president after Roosevelt died, and ultimately the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine to spread democracy and support those that fought along with the Allies, and then the Marshall Plan, which was the actual process of sending support, mainly monetary support, to the European countries that were devastated after the war, and looking to rebuild Europe because a strong Europe meant a stable Europe and a stable West. The first active action that Stalin took to demonstrate his displeasure with the actions of the West to support a stronger Europe comes after, like I said a couple of minutes ago, comes after the West combined their three portions, France, United States, and Britain. But specifically when they went and created their own currency. And the West wanted West Germany to have its own, again, currency. That was like the straw that broke the camel's back for Stalin. Because Berlin was physically located in the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Germany, Stalin set up a blockade which did not allow, on rail, road, or canal, the West to supply food and anything else to the west half of Berlin, solely because he was mad, frustrated over the unified currency for Western Germany. This happened specifically in June of 1948, so just a few years after the end of the war in 1945. This is when President Truman enacts what was called Operation Vittles, Vittles being like old French word for food, but Operation Vittles, which is popularly known as the Berlin Airlift. He decided that he wasn't going to give up. He didn't want to go to combat. He didn't want to fight Stalin militarily in this issue. But he wasn't going to give up on supporting the West. So he started the Berlin Airlift. 2.3 million tons of cargo sent into West Berlin. One plane took off every 30 seconds or landed every 30 seconds. A total of 300,000-ish flights. Continued to support the West and wasn't going to let Stalin dictate what the West was going to do. Eventually, and this is a key to the idea of NATO being a potentially effective organization, after 9 months of the Berlin Airlift, Stalin lifted the blockade. And so what that said to the West, the countries that were at this point in 1948 already having discussions about creating a North Atlantic Treaty Organization that, again, was eventually signed in 1949. But what it said was this type of an entity could work, right? We came together, we unified along with the U.S., and we said, listen, we're not interested in your blockade. We're going to send planes in, 300,000 flights, in order to prove to you that we're not going to be persuaded and influenced by your behavior. Stalin lifts the blockade. The idea of a unified Europe under a defense pact, more interesting. It was put bluntly in late 1948 by British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, who said the West needed a, quote, treaty of alliance and mutual assistance, end quote, built upon the UN principles. This is right during the Berlin Airlift and on the heels of the signing of the NATO documents. Okay, so as I said, the document contains 14 articles, basically just describing what each country, the countries weren't labeled in there, but what each partner should strive to be, what they should intend to participate in, and what they could provide. But the most important is Article 5, and it's the one that's often discussed in the media and we hear most often talked about. And that's because Article 5 is the portion that discusses mutual defense. This is the language that says if any one of us in NATO is attacked on our land, that we have the right to unify, and all countries are going to treat any attack on any of them as if it's an attack on all of them. This is actually a big deal for the United States. I mean, if you look, like we were just discussing, you look back to the League of Nations, there was an isolationism in the U.S. for a long, long time. And it wasn't until Wilson really tried to push this coming out of the shell, if you will, in the U.S. Remember, they didn't even want to get involved in World War I. It was a European problem. But Woodrow Wilson wanted to join the League of Nations, but the Senate wouldn't ratify it. And the U.S. really did have an isolationist-like view at that point. And so the fact that the U.S. would actually get involved in some type of a contract that would force the U.S. to go to war, potentially, if somebody, let's say, invaded Luxembourg, that wasn't something that sat too well with a lot of Americans and was really a big change politically. But nonetheless, the U.S. agrees, again, particularly after the Berlin Airlift, that this is the type of organization that Europe needs and the United States needs in order to ensure that we restrict this spread of communism and the potential threat, military threat, that the Soviet Union could be. Discussions are started. The United States says, we'll do it, but Europe's got to be united. We can't have those that are interested in signing in the beginning working to their own ends. I mean, everyone is their own nation and they have their own specific desires, but ultimately on the major framework, within the major framework, all of the countries need to be united. So in order to prove that they could do that, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the UK signed something called the Brussels Treaty in 1948 to prove that they could be unified and that they would operate as a union. The U.S. took that as a very, very important step forward, and then they went back and through Congress passed the Vandenberg Resolution, which allowed, specifically in the Senate, which allowed the U.S. to become part of a mutual defense system. This was now that wasn't something that was argued could be legal without this resolution. So it passed within the Senate, and NATO now became something the United States could legally enter. And they did in 1949. You might ask, okay, so now that this organization is created, and you have these 12 countries that I had said earlier had joined: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the UK, and the US. What do we do now? Decisions have to be made about how this thing is going to work. So in the beginning, NATO takes a military view and focuses on the military aspects of the organization first. It chooses General Eisenhower, as we know, the hero of World War II in Europe, and names him the first commander of SHAPE. So the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe. So SHAPE is like the military arm, if you will, of the NATO organization. And Eisenhower goes on a tour, and I mean that literally, in the tail end of 1949 into 1950, and travels around to each one of the other countries and says, thanks for joining. What do you got? What can you provide? Based on who you are, what can you do for NATO? What can you do for the defense of Europe? Luxembourg is a small country. What can you do? Iceland doesn't have any military. It provided steel. Canada gave a lot of money, but it doesn't have a big military. So what were you going to do? He traveled all over the place. Shortly after, NATO created a civilian secretariat for duty in Paris, and this was Lord Ismay of Britain. It was Ismay who famously said that NATO was created to, quote, keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, end quote. So NATO really is partitioned, if you will. It's one organization, but it's really partitioned into a civilian leadership and a military leadership. Notice in the quote there from Ismay, right in the middle, that NATO was created to, quote, keep the Americans in, because they knew without the U.S., this wasn't going to work. Now, militarily, Eisenhower's going around and asking all of these countries what they can do to provide for the defense of Europe. Understand the daunting task that he faced. At this point, the NATO forces that had agreed to work together could have put together at this point 14 divisions, about 1,800 aircraft, and had access to about 15 airfields. This is because the countries involved in World War II were devastated, mainly the European countries, and they were all downsizing in order to recuperate. And so there just wasn't a lot left. Compare this to the Soviets now, who did lose loads of human capital and treasure during the war, but Russia's huge. And they just had access to much more at the end of the war. So when NATO formed, the Soviets had 175 divisions and about 20,000 aircraft. This is a problem. An interesting anecdote, when Eisenhower was traveling Europe, he had asked one of his advisors, given the current state of the difference between these NATO countries now, these newly formed countries under this newly formed organization, and the Soviets, what would the Soviets need in order to get to the English Channel if they wanted to? And the advisor just responded by saying, shoes. I mean, that's it. They just need shoes, because they had everything else. They had the people, they had the structure, they had the divisions, they had the support, they had the logistics. And who was going to stop them, Right? Now you can argue whether they thought properly, they being the West, thought properly and really needed to build a defense, because why would Stalin be interested in invading Europe, right? But clearly at the time, that was a concern. And, with Stalin creating, not Stalin creating, but with Russia creating its Soviet Socialist republics officially in 22 and then expanding westward, there was a fear that when Stalin came around, that he would swallow up parts of Europe. And if you think that fear is real, and you've got 14 divisions, and the other one's got 175, that math doesn't work. So we're coming out of the 40s into the 50s, and we have another area, like I had mentioned quickly before, that's split down the middle as to who can control one side and the other, and this is Korea. So in the north, the Soviets and the communists have influence and control over what happens there, and then the west and the south, drawn along the 38th parallel. The north is communist. China's communist. Again, China's not really a big player at this point, but they're eventually coming around, right? They just had the Chinese Civil War in the late 40s. They're beginning to come around. China's on the border of North Korea. And Kim Il-sung asks the Soviet Union, asks Stalin, hey, I really think the Koreans in the South are not interested in falling under this West Democrat free leadership. I think they really just want to be part of a unified Korea under a communist umbrella. So do you mind if I go ahead and invade? Stalin kind of hems and haws. Eventually he says, yes, only if China agrees to support North Korea if they do it. And they do, so they invade. You know how the Korean War goes. They get all the way down practically to Seoul, and then they're pushed all the way back up and ends in 53. But there's another event that demonstrates the communist idea pushing itself further and further west, south, through Korea, and is intent on spreading its ideals and swallowing up more territory. Remember, at the same time, when you're having this East-West divide, the West is looking at themselves and saying, this whole NATO thing is voluntary. We believe that it's a good organization and we need it for stability, but we're only going to allow people into the organization if they really want to be here. We might influence them a little bit if they have a lot of money and they have military, whatever, but we're not literally going to go into their capitals and shoot people if they don't join NATO. But that's what Stalin did. And so as he grew and eventually developed the Warsaw Pact, as that grew, a lot of it was strong-armed. I mean, he invaded Hungary and he invaded Czechoslovakia because he wanted them to do what he wanted them to do. He really was, at that point, a threat. Korea proved that to the West. In the middle of the Korean War, we have the first non-original 12 join the group, join NATO. It's in 52, Turkey and Greece join. Greece joins because it helped to send troops to South Korea and had already, it was receiving funds from the Marshall Plan, so it already had kind of chosen which way it wanted to go. Also, there was a civil war going on in Greece, and the communists had committed an uprising, and again, which led to a civil war. When that ended, Greece decided, okay, we're going to go with the West and not the East. And so they wanted to join in 52. And Turkey joined as well. They were being pressured by Stalin to accept military forces, Soviet military forces, because Stalin wanted control over the Dardanelles and the Bosporus Strait. And Turkey didn't want Soviet troops in its country. The United States and the West was looking to develop a relationship with Turkey. But again, it wasn't saying, if you don't like us, we're going to invade. Well, Stalin was. So Turkey said, you know what, we're not going to be able to protect ourselves against him. Let's join this new organization, NATO, where we have the protection of Greater Europe, Greater Western Europe, and the U.S., and boom, they come in 52. The next one, as I had said earlier, one of the most important, 1955, was West Germany. Now, this becomes a turning point as well. This becomes another, large step forward in terms of NATO's creation. Because before, you had the NATO countries who were not contiguous with Soviet land, if you will, Soviet states within the USSR. Now you do. And you have it literally meters away. You have it just separated by a wall in Germany, in Berlin. And, the NATO charter says that one member country, physically attacked by another, can trigger Article 5, and therefore you have combat. Well, once you accept Western Germany into NATO, you now are just placing yourself meters away from a potential adversary, which could lead to really a triggering of Article 5 way differently than, say, with a member Greece or Luxembourg. They're just not close enough. Now you have West Germany joining the alliance. This is the next the next straw that broke the camel's back and created the Warsaw Pact, where the USSR was expanding at this point, but it didn't really have a unified and a collective defense strategy. Well, now that it does, and it really just created its own NATO and said, if anybody on our side is attacked by anybody else, then we're going to have a collective defense against whomever it is. The Warsaw Pact sees Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and there comes that separation with the wall, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. Thankfully, it didn't lead to any direct conflict. So coming out of the 50s, now we're transitioning to the 60s and 70s with NATO. And really, at this point, these decades become more of like what's considered steady state operations, right? Most, if not all, of the countries on both sides realize they both have their pacts. You have NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and we both understand each other, and we're developing nuclear weapons. We're in the depth of the Cold War. I mean, we have some flare-ups like the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 with Khrushchev after Stalin goes, and Vietnam. But there wasn't a time when there was really a significant concern that there would be direct conflict. I know with all the talk of the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 and whether there was going to be nuclear war, I mean, historians argue over whether that was actually true or not. But aside from that isolated incident, really, everything else that was occurring during these couple decades of the 60s and the 70s, there was very little fear that combat would break out. It was at the end of the 70s when NATO and Soviet forces came really, really close to direct conflict, and that was in Afghanistan. So that, the story goes that there's a coup in Afghanistan, and the Soviets are losing influence over Kabul, so they invade in order to reestablish and reassert their control. And the Mujahideen, the local Afghans, as well as fighters from really across the world, in many ways, enter Afghanistan to fight against the atheist devil of the USSR. And as we've come to know later on, the CIA got involved. The United States was involved in passing weapons and eventually stingers and all these things. So, the U.S. through a proxy, but the U.S. was tangentially involved in combating Soviet forces. But again, thankfully, that didn't lead to any direct combat between the two. There were some missiles that were placed that triggered each other. The Russians sent some SS-20s into Europe, which really pissed off the NATO countries, and they ended up deploying Pershing IIs. Ultimately, that led up to the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that Gorbachev signed in 85. But nonetheless, more Cold War tactics, if you will, indirect, not direct combat. Right after the invasion in 79, you do have Spain that enters NATO in 82, and that basically they enter on their own because they had their own changes at home. They had a new constitution in 1978, which led to a much more democratic Spain, who decided Portugal's in NATO and France is in NATO and the UK is in NATO, so they decided to join NATO as well. So then comes a pretty important time in NATO's history, and that's the 90s. And the 90s are important because that's when we can really clearly link what NATO is doing today and why it's important today with what was happening in the 90s. And what I mean by that is, ultimately in the beginning of NATO, the idea was really a collective defense against the Soviet Union. Now, that's not actually in the documentation, but that's what it was made for. And in the 90s, you have a post-Soviet era. You had the Iraq invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which did not involve NATO troops in the Soviet Union, so they skip over that. But in 91, and the Soviets can't get involved because they're crumbling, right? And they eventually fall in 91. And so that's when the first question comes up, well, there's no more Soviet Union, so do we need NATO? I mean, what's NATO really for? And the first This is when we'll first start to hear the term NATO operating in, quote, out of area, end quote. So NATO doing things in support of NATO goals, but not in NATO countries, and not with or against the adversary that they had first thought they'd be dealing with. But what they came to learn pretty quickly is that an equally destructive, potentially destructive enemy existed after the Soviet Union fell in 91, and that is the vacuum left over by the fall of the Soviets, ironically. So some changes strategically are being made. The NATO leadership is saying, what do we do now? We think this NATO thing works. We've demonstrated how a strong, unified stance can push back against bullies. Do we really abolish this thing now that the Soviet Union no longer technically exists? So they changed their first strategic concept in 1991 to expand out of a focus of just the military and include economic, political, environmental, and social realms. So it's not just that NATO would come together in support of NATO's ideals if attacked, but if they're affected directly in those other areas, economically, politically, that they may have to act. They do this directly. They start under the new strategic concept really in 94 when they begin what they called the Mediterranean dialogue. So they spoke with Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Mauritania, Morocco, Tunisia, and then Algeria, who eventually ended up in joining in 2000. But so they expand out of area in having these dialogues with other countries who they would like to bring into the fold ideologically with the Mediterranean dialogue. And in 94, they create the Partnership for Peace program, which allowed non-NATO members to provide information to NATO members that may be beneficial to NATO and set up a process where these other countries who were working with NATO but not part of could someday become members. And there's a long process that's involved. It's something that actually Ukraine's going through now, which isn't going to happen clearly while it's at war with Russia. But nonetheless, this process is started. So now you have, again, the expansion, not physically, technically physically, but an expansion of NATO. Now, like I said earlier, what's also happening at the time is the Soviet Union fell in 91, and the power vacuum that the Soviet Union left is really becoming obvious in the mid to late 90s, specifically in the Balkans with the disintegration of Yugoslavia. So in 1999, NATO has another strategic concept change where they want to engage in not only collective defense, but they add crisis response as well, which allows legally, at least in NATO's language, NATO to act to respond to a crisis without Article 5 activation. This was specifically the authority used by President Clinton to participate in sending 60,000 NATO troops to implement the Dayton Peace Accords in the Balkans. Although tactically on the ground, NATO didn't really operate as effectively as they may have wanted. There was a struggle with command relationships and logistics and other things, but what it did demonstrate is that NATO could work within this crisis response environment and would be relevant, even though technically the Soviet Union didn't exist. The power vacuum left by the Soviet Union did, and now we have a problem where Yugoslavia is falling apart because Moscow can't keep it together, and there's a genocide, and nobody can enforce the international law to keep civilians alive. So NATO steps in. It's also in 99 that what was called the Visegrad Triangle, so Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, went through enough change, reformation, after leaving the umbrella of the Soviet Union, decided to lean towards Western ideals, and the three of them joined that year in 99. Next, we move to a more recent event that more people really have an understanding of because it directly affected the United States, and that's obviously the attacks on 9/11. Now, the first and only time, regardless of whether the Soviet Union exists and its crisis response, collective defense, whatever, it's the first time and only time Article 5 was ever enacted by NATO, where one country stood up and said, we were attacked by an outside entity, literally on our ground, and we need the rest of NATO to come to our defense. And they did. And the U.S. asked, NATO said yes, and into Afghanistan, NATO went. Now, it wasn't quick and easy, right? So it was initially the United States went in. It started Operation Enduring Freedom, became a CENTCOM-led operation. So the commander of CENTCOM was the lead into Afghanistan in the early months after 9/11. A Bonn conference is held. The conference is held in Bonn, Germany, and the decision was made to create ISAF, so the International Security Assistance Force, which at the very beginning was British-led, and it was led by the British to try and kick the Taliban out of Kabul specifically, and it did just that. But eventually, a few months later, NATO was given, after decisions were made, NATO was given the command of ISAF. It was not just a British-led operation. And eventually, as it continued to grow, ISAF controlled all of Afghanistan by 2006. So it was a wholly NATO operation from 2006 on. There was, Operation Enduring Freedom is at least from the U.S. perspective, didn't go away, and so the U.S. was doing things that met its goals, but was also doing it through NATO command. It's kind of hard to explain. So I was there in 2012, and as a member of ISAF, and I can tell you that the Americans were in charge. The commander was a 4-star American general, at least in my time, General Allen, and you can imagine that the decisions made by the ISAF commander, who happened to be an American commander, were good for the Americans. But we were all there for the same goal, anyways. It wasn't like, at least the big players were on the same page. The United States, Canada, Australia, Great Britain. We were all lockstep with what we were trying to accomplish in Afghanistan. And even though it was a NATO mission, those countries were the ones that really sent the most support in terms of boots on the ground. So it wasn't really that OEF and ISAF were competing missions. It was that they were integrated and really just trying to meet the same ends. What I will say, as an aside, and I jump off the history path here, what I will say is it is really kind of a unique challenge being in the American military and operating under American command structure and then falling in on a NATO mission, even so, led by an American commander. And there's just a lot of differences, and there's different cultures, different languages, clearly different military philosophies, not grand differences, but nonetheless some differences. And each country has its own way of running a staff and tasking subordinates and conducting logistics. None of them are right or wrong. They're just different. And it's not that NATO allows 32 different logistics concepts to operate independently during a NATO mission. And it's silly. It doesn't happen that way. There's a unified understanding, but it may not be the understanding and the process that you're typically used to. Now, honestly, when it comes to at least the NATO mission in Afghanistan, that it leaned very heavily towards the American and the British way of doing business, which made it a much easier for the Americans and the British. Again, the vast majority of the force structure. But for the other countries, it may be very different. And getting all of the commands and all the leaders, all of the staffs to work in unison it's certainly not impossible, but it takes time, it takes training, it takes repetitions. I would argue that ISAF got pretty good at what it was doing, at least in Afghanistan, as the years went on. You're constantly having commanders and units rotating in and out, so there's always a learning curve. But nonetheless, a really good structure was developed, and eventually NATO really got its feet under itself and was able to do a pretty good job Now, let me caveat that. When I say that NATO was able to do a good job, what I mean is by operating together. That's wholly separate from a different discussion about whether, the United States and NATO are no longer in Afghanistan and the Taliban is there. I got it. That's a separate discussion. That has nothing to do with how NATO operated amongst itself in its staff work and those things. That it got pretty good at. While this is going on, 2004 comes, another big year in terms of countries joining: Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Many were supporting operations in Afghanistan at the time before they became official members. And they were part of the Partners for Peace program. They had demonstrated earlier that they were no longer interested in falling under the communist umbrella of influence, right? The Soviet Union's gone away for years now, 1991, almost 15 years, 13 years, and they're looking to shift west, and they did. So they looked to join in 2004, then you're followed by Albania and Croatia in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, and then North Macedonia in 2020. Now we end up moving ourselves closer to today, and we get towards Finland and Sweden 2023 and 2024, respectively. This decision by these two countries, the decision by these two countries is different in the sense that there is an actual event which triggered their joining, and that was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Norway has been a member of NATO since the outset. And, if you look at a map, right, Norway is right there. And so Sweden and Finland decided they didn't want to be left out. What they saw was Norway's involved there on the west. NATO has expanded significantly since its inception. Countries involved in their south. And they're the only two countries in the Baltics now that aren't involved. And they're they're kind of surrounded by NATO countries and then Russia in the Arctic and to the east. And so they decide at this point, well, we don't want to be left out. Right? We don't want to be, because we're going to end up being unprotected if Russia, Putin does something like it did in Ukraine and decides it just wants to invade another country for whatever reasons it comes up with. We don't want to be that country that doesn't have a legal ability to get NATO involved to protect us, Sweden and Finland can't protect itself against Russia. Let's be honest. They have small militaries, very capable militaries. Let's make that clear. And the Swedes make a brilliant fighter craft, and their submarines are outstanding, and the Finns do well. It's not about the quality of their military. It's really just about the size. They're just smaller. And in order to deal with a large force like Russia has, you can see it in Ukraine, without NATO backing, they wouldn't be able to survive. So it's a benefit to them in that they get the defensive support, but then it's a benefit generally to NATO because now you have what they call the Baltic umbrella. You have all the Baltic countries covering the Baltic Sea, and Russia has no little transit route, if you will, to go through the Baltic and get around the NATO countries in the air and through the sea. Now it's fully covered. But again, that leads us to really the concluding part of the podcast here today, and that is some of the questions that have come up about NATO as it stands today. So let's address some of those. Why does NATO even exist if the Soviet Union doesn't exist? And I think we've covered that in today's episode. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. NATO understood that. But it also understood that a power vacuum was created after the wall fell. And Yugoslavia is a perfect example. So NATO continued to provide stability in the event that countries that were once part of the Soviet Union no longer had the strength of Moscow and potentially led to a genocide like it did in the former Yugoslavia. And so NATO could operate in an area to continue to push Western ideals and keep stability without the Soviet Union. So that's one of the reasons that NATO is still there. And technically, like I had said earlier, there is no mandate, there is no dictate in the document itself that said, okay, and by the way, when the Soviet Union is no longer around, then we're just going to fold. It doesn't say that. It just says that these countries, should they choose to be together, they're going to be together. And if they're attacked by somebody that they don't like and they don't agree with, then they can come to their own defense. So it's not like NATO, in a sense, is breaking any law by not going away in 1991. Now, in terms of NATO expansion, it's written right in the document that NATO can expand if a country demonstrates that it meets the values and can provide assistance, it can provide resources, and it's agreed unanimously amongst the members that it can become part of NATO. It does say there is some geographic, I don't want to call them boundaries, but let's call them, frameworks, that it does say Europe. It doesn't say the Pacific specifically. And you can argue, and this is one of the things that Putin brings up, you can argue about what is really Europe and what isn't, right? You could say Ukraine is a European country, and then Russia will argue that no, it really isn't. It's a Western Asian country. There's no actual answer, but it would be hard to argue that Hawaii, for example, is located in Europe. It's not, right? And technically Hawaii is not even a part of NATO. Even though it's one of the 50 states, it's not part of NATO because it's not in Europe and it's not in the North Atlantic either. So there is some black and white kind of when you say things like the heart of the Pacific, but there isn't when you're talking about Eastern Europe. So there is no legal, again, dictate that says NATO can't, quote unquote, expand. We've also talked about NATO operating out of area. It's a discussion that has been had since the very early days. Clearly, it wasn't as prominent of a discussion in the earliest days of NATO in the 50s, and into the 60s. But it has been discussed way before Russia invaded Ukraine. The Mediterranean dialogue with some of the Middle Eastern countries in the 90s covered out of area. Crisis response, which was a strategic viewpoint change in 1999, discussed out of area and how NATO may respond to crises outside of the actual member countries. And going back to NATO expansion for a second too, there is a difference between NATO pushing and pulling. And what I mean by that is to say that, if there are other countries that fit within the four corners of the document, Ukraine being one of them, considered by many to be a European country, that if it wants to join NATO, that's on Ukraine. So what? It may benefit NATO as a whole, and President Putin could argue, well, I mean, of course, adding Ukraine to NATO would be a benefit to you. So of course you want to add Ukraine, and you're twisting their arm, and what are you trying to say? You didn't do that during the Warsaw Pact? I mean, what are you trying to say? That you're not doing that now in eastern Ukraine by claiming through history that having this land coming back to you is a benefit to you in Russia? But aside from all of that, regardless of whether you think that President Putin is right, quote unquote, right, in terms of his historical understanding, which I would argue he's not, but even if you were to say he was, if you're on the outside looking in, you have to make a moral judgment. There's no way of getting around making a national security decision or having an opinion without having morality somehow intertwined in that thought process. You either think that NATO and what NATO stands for is quote unquote good and better for global stability, or you don't. Or on the opposite side, you either think NATO is quote bad and its actions triggered Russia to respond, and then therefore Russia had to invade Ukraine. You either think that's morally good. I hear people bring up the analogy, well, if go back to 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, the Soviet Union wanted to put missiles in Cuba, and the United States said, get out of our hemisphere, right? Okay, I got it. The U.S. would do the same thing. I mean, if the Warsaw Pact was expanding into Mexico, the United States would respond, just like President Putin did, right? Well, first, there's one slight difference. I don't know if the United States would necessarily invade Mexico. There's no evidence. There's no evidence that that is the case. And Putin did invade Ukraine but here nor there, whatever. You got to make the moral choice. What I do know in this instance is that from my perspective, and maybe it seems obvious being an American, but from my perspective, NATO has been a force for good. NATO has allowed countries that once fell under an oppressive regime led by Stalin and his cronies to become democracies in some sense, and provided their people way more freedoms than they ever had. And NATO is a big part of that. And so you either think that NATO is a positive influence or you don't. And, I'm on the side of, while it's not perfect, no organization is, no country is. If you're to put together the pros and the cons, I'm a pro-NATO advocate. Okay, there it is. 75 years, NATO's been around. Ideologically starts in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. There's a fear of the communist spread. The events occur in World War II. The Soviets literally do expand throughout the early 20th century and then become much stronger after World War II. There's an actual fear. NATO's created in 1949. It operates through multiple issues, Korea, Yugoslavia, and here we are today. And we just had a conversation where I threw in some opinion about whether I think it's good or bad. So, you decide. That's up for you to decide whether you think it's what your opinion is on whether NATO did expand or didn't expand, whatever. But an interesting history nonetheless, knowing that we're coming up on, or just past rather, 75 years of NATO history. So thanks for taking the time today. Again, I'm your host, John Malik, here on the Headlines in History podcast. Thanks for coming, all of those that return and those that have been here for the first time. And hopefully I was able to keep you engaged, and we'll see you next episode.